Yeah, it's so funny and it's so schizophrenic because Trump in that clip and when he speaks about BRICS, he often says, well, BRICS is not a threat, but they're also threatening the dollar. So I need to threaten them with massive tariffs to crush them. In another interview that Trump did in a press conference at the White House, he said that BRICS is dead. He said this right after coming back to the White House for his second term. He said that he threatened tariffs on BRICS, and as soon as he did that, he said BRICS died, which obviously is completely absurd. Not only is BRICS not dead, it's thriving. It's growing in size and influence. It's constantly expanding. This June, Vietnam accepted its invitation to join as a partner of BRICS. And at the summit that was held this July in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, it was a very successful summit. I agree with you. We can talk more about it and some of the Western misleading propaganda about it. But this was the first summit that featured all 10 of the members and the new 10 partner countries that were officially added at the beginning of this year. And last year in 2024, there were 5 new members added, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, the UAE, and Iran. So we were talking about the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran and the fear that the U.S. has of a coalition, a partnership between China, Russia, and Iran. This was spelled out by Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, which basically has become the kind of brain of the U.S. government, especially under the Trump administration. They've been outsourcing so many operations to Palantir. And one of the co-founders of Palantir is the far-right billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel, who employed Vice President J.D. Vance. It was the only real job that J.D. Vance had after he went to Yale Law School. He worked for this far-right billionaire oligarch in Silicon Valley who says very clearly that he does not support democracy. And he wrote in the Cato Institute, this libertarian think tank, that capitalism is more important than democracy, that people should not have a say, only corporations should have a say in political affairs. He co-founded Palantir. Palantir is basically running the U.S. government, especially spying not only on foreigners, but on U.S. citizens. The New York Times reported that Palantir is doing a massive mass surveillance operation to compile intelligence on all Americans under Trump. So this is the so-called free speech president, right? So anyway, the CEO of Palantir, Alex Karp, said that the U.S. is preparing for war on China, Russia, and Iran. The former the late U.S. imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, he's now passed away, but he was previously the national security advisor under Jimmy Carter, a hardened war criminal who oversaw the U.S. proxy war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, in which the U.S. supported the Mujahideen that became al-Qaeda and the Taliban, including Osama bin Laden, who was the leader of the Arab Mujahideen, fundraising for the CIA-backed death squads to fight against the Afghan socialist government in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Well, the war criminal who oversaw that operation was Brzezinski, and Brzezinski wrote in his book, The Grand Chessboard, in 1997, that the biggest threat to the U.S. unipolar empire was what he called an anti-hegemonic coalition between China, Russia, and Iran, which is essentially what we see today. I mean, it's not formal. China does not join formal alliances, but it's unofficial. There's a close partnership between China and Russia and also Iran. And what we're seeing is, so anyway, with all that said, they're in BRICS, right? China, Russia, and Iran are now in BRICS, along with many other countries. And getting back to this summit and Trump's threats, this is all related to exactly what we've been talking about with the U.S. and Israel waging war on Iran, the U.S. proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, using Ukraine as this, battering ram against Russia. It's all part of the same strategy to try to maintain U.S. global imperial dominance, unipolar dominance. And of course, we're in an increasingly multipolar world. This is one of the main things discussed at the BRICS summit, along with de-dollarization. And the U.S. empire has really 2 or 3 main weapons, very powerful weapons. One, it has a big military, but we've seen that the power of that military is probably overstated because, the U.S. is now spending $1 trillion. I was already spending over $1 trillion per year on the military unofficially. Now it's officially spending over $1 trillion officially. But just because you plow money into something doesn't mean that you actually are investing that money well. We've seen that the U.S. military lost pretty much every war that it's fought since World War II. Even in a country like Iraq, which is a relatively small country. And now we see that the U.S. is losing the war in Ukraine. It's basically lost already. And they're talking about war on China. I mean, can you give me a break? Anytime the Pentagon does war games, they lose these war games against China. So I think that the power of the U.S. military is overstated. I mean, it can bully and destroy small countries, like it invaded Panama, it invaded Grenada, it destroyed Iraq, it destroyed Libya. But when it's actually facing near peer strategic competitors like Russia and China, it can't win. So I think that's exaggerated. Another weapon that you could say is arguable, the U.S. has a very powerful media propaganda apparatus that it can use to spread propaganda around the world. And it used to do so through, soft power organizations funding so-called media outlets and so-called NGOs through the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. But I mean, even those so-called NGOs in a lot of countries, like in Russia and certainly in China and other countries, they've cracked down on these U.S. color revolution groups that are used to meddle in foreign affairs. So the U.S. still does have very powerful propaganda institutions, the media, which is not it's not to inform people, it's to manufacture consent for U.S. wars of aggression. But even that influence is declining over time. So the last real weapon, a very strong weapon that the U.S. empire has, is the dollar. And that is definitely the most powerful weapon the U.S. has. And the U.S. can impose sanctions on countries and try to kick them out of the international financial institutions that are dominated by the U.S. But we've seen that over time, even that weapon has become weaker and weaker. Now we see that 1/3 of all countries on earth are under U.S. sanctions. 60% of low-income countries are under U.S. sanctions. And the more that the U.S. abuses the sanction weapon, the more it backfires and incentivizes countries to seek alternatives. Russia has been at the forefront of de-dollarization. China has joined in the de-dollarization efforts. They both have their own alternatives to the SWIFT interbank messaging system, which is controlled by the U.S. And BRICS is the main international platform pushing for de-dollarization. This is why Trump is so afraid of it, because he recognizes that without that weapon, the U.S. dollar, the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar, the U.S. empire loses a lot of power. And it's already losing wars. Its propaganda apparatus is weakening. And if it loses the dollar, I mean, that could be a fatal blow to the U.S. empire.
I think a lot of people misunderstated and misinterpreted the significance of this summit. We saw Lula da Silva, of course, this was held in Brazil this year, the summit, and he was the chair, and he had some very choice words for Donald Trump. Said that BRICS and developing countries are not looking for an emperor right now. And so I'm curious on what you saw was the significance toward these moves toward de-dollarization, because everyone was saying, from Dilma Rousseff, head of the NDB, the New Development Bank, Lula himself, Lavrov, everybody was saying, well, this is going to take some time. But everybody was talking about it.
There's so many things I could respond to there. I want to make a few different points that I think are important to keep in mind. First of all, you mentioned Lula and the fact that this was in Brazil. And I agree with what you said earlier about this being a historic summit. And it was misrepresented in the Western media, as always, and portrayed as a failure, largely because Putin did not attend, China's president Xi Jinping did not attend, and also the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian did not attend. But I think this is grossly overstated, the significance of this. First of all, Putin spoke via video stream, and he sent probably the second most important person in the Russian government after him, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. China sent the second in command of the premier, Li Qiang, who is a very important person in the Chinese government. Again, the most important after President Xi. And then, Iran's president, Pezeshkian, did not attend because he's preparing for a potential new war that the U.S. and Israel are going to wage against him. We already talked about this. I mean, if he he's concerned that if he left Iran, the U.S. and Israel would restart the war, and then they don't have their commander-in-chief in the country as they're fighting a war. I mean, he was also concerned that he could be assassinated as he was traveling. So yeah, obviously, when, like I said, the war in the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran is not over. It was paused, but it's not over. So of course he didn't attend. But okay, so really, also Putin didn't attend the summit, the BRICS summit in 2023, which is also historic. It was the first summit where they expanded and added new members, including Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the UAE. And at that time, Putin didn't attend because of the arrest warrant issued by the ICC over the war in Ukraine, which is so deeply hypocritical and absurd, because we've seen that Netanyahu, the leader of the Israeli regime, who's carrying out a genocide with the support of the US, there's an outstanding ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu, and he's traveling constantly to Washington, going over European airspace. The Hungarian regime is supporting him. Viktor Orban loves to portray himself as like anti-woke and like fighting against globalism. But meanwhile, Hungary is also staunchly supporting Israel's genocide and doing everything it can to support Netanyahu, like the US regime. And that's why Hungary is actually withdrawing from the ICC in solidarity with Israel's genocide, because it's doing everything it can to support the Israeli genocide. I mean, Hungary has always been Orban he sometimes claims to be, oh, I'm fighting against globalism because he's pro-Russia, but he's always been deeply anti-Muslim and Islamophobic, and has been allied against the revolutionary forces in West Asia, against the axis of resistance, helping the US and Israel fight against the axis of resistance. So, I mean, there's so much hypocrisy. Anyway, getting back to the ICC, Netanyahu is the European regimes that are also supporting the genocide in Gaza are helping Israel carry out this genocide and allowing Netanyahu cross over their airspace. And yet they're the ones saying, we must arrest Putin. We have to arrest Putin because of the ICC arrest warrant. So this shows why these international institutions have been destroyed by all these Western regimes that talk about the rules-based international order, but they don't follow the rules when it's convenient for them. They tear up the rules when they don't like it, when they don't like those rules. So they say, oh, the ICC should only be for Global South countries and Russia. By the way, this was stated by the former de facto foreign minister of the EU, and who was Joseph Borrell. And there are reports that this was also stated by other figures, other top officials in in these European regimes. Karim Khan, who is the ICC prosecutor, did an interview in CNN in which he said that he was told by European regime officials that the ICC is only for the third world, as they put it, for African countries. I mean, this is the racist colonialist mentality of these Western regimes. They talk about the rules-based international order. They don't believe in rules. They think Putin should be arrested, but Netanyahu should be given the Nobel Peace Prize for carrying out genocide. I mean, it's outlandish. Anyway, getting back to BRICS. I know I'm on these asides here, but it's related. So yeah, Putin did not attend the 2023 summit or the 2025 summit, although he did speak via video link, because it was out of respect for other BRICS countries hosting, South Africa in 2023, Brazil in 2025, because these countries are parties to the ICC, and he didn't want to put these countries in a delicate diplomatic situation. However, it's not that significant. Further, the fact that he did not attend is not that significant. Furthermore, I actually think that the fact that President Xi did not attend is also significant, but not in the way that Western propaganda thinks, saying that this is like supposedly China is like there's a fight in BRICS. It's not what's happening. Actually, I think this was a diplomatic move by China to show that BRICS is not just about China. It's not just about Russia. We talk about the fact that China, Russia, and Iran are in BRICS, but there are now 20 countries in BRICS, 10 members and 10 partners. And the fact that Brazil hosted this, the fact that Brazil hosted other the fact that Brazil invited other Latin American countries, including Mexico, was invited as an observer, even though it's not part of BRICS. That was very important and symbolic. China was showing, by not sending President Xi, that this is not about China. that this is actually about the global south, and many other countries are part of BRICS, and they're coming together. And yes, China is an important part of BRICS, but it's not a China-led organization, which is what Western propaganda often portrays it as. This is a global south-led organization. It's the voice of the global majority, the global south plus Russia, that's been kicked out of the global north, out of the West. Although it was never in the West, but kicked out of Europe at least. And what we now see is that BRICS is growing in influence, and there's more and more of a coherent vision. And Lula spelled out this vision at the BRICS summit. He said that BRICS is an heir to the non-aligned movement, and he also invoked the Bandung Conference of 1955. This was also mentioned by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, and Malaysia has now joined BRICS as a partner country. And both Lula and Anwar said that BRICS follows in the footsteps of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference. What does this mean? The Bandung Conference of 1955 was called by the formerly colonized countries of Africa and Asia. They came together in Bandung, Indonesia, under the leftist anti-colonial leader of Indonesia, Sukarno, to talk about ways to work together to fight against colonialism and to empower the global south, to support decolonization efforts. Similarly, the non-aligned movement was founded in the 1960s by formerly colonized countries, almost all with socialist governments, the initial founders of the non-aligned movement, saying that they refused to go along with U.S. imperialism in the first Cold War against the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. So BRICS is now bringing back this anti-colonial mantle. They've picked up the anti-colonial mantle, and they're fighting against U.S. dollar hegemony, which is a form of imperialism. They're fighting against Western imperialism. And it's not just China and Russia and Iran. It's a larger group that continues to grow. And despite the political differences that they have shown that they have a lot of similarities and common goals. And we can talk about some of those. Of course, de-dollarization is at the heart of that, but there are other initiatives going on. But I think this was a symbolic summit because it wasn't just about China. The fact that Xi wasn't there made it about the other countries as well, and showed that there's a lot of interest. And this is not just countries that are like puppets of China, as we hear in the Western media, right? Like the propaganda narrative in the West, which is absurd, is that BRICS is the Chinese empire's attempt to create its own organization to rule the world. It's complete nonsense. BRICS is not NATO. NATO was created by the US to be a US imperialist organization so the US could control Europe, keep Germany down, prevent Russia from joining, and keep the US on top. That's not, the G7 is similar. I mean, it's the cartel of the colonizers, the countries that colonize most of the world. That's not what BRICS is. BRICS is an it's an anti-hegemonic organization consisting of the global majority that's fighting for a more multipolar world, a truly democratic world that's not dominated by the Western colonial powers. That's not a democracy. You can't talk about democracy when the colonial powers dominate all of the international so-called multilateral organizations that the U.S. has veto power in. The U.S. has veto power in the UN Security Council, which it abuses constantly. The U.S. has veto power in the IMF. The U.S. has veto power in the World Bank. The U.S. has veto power in the WTO and has sabotaged the WTO with its veto power. BRICS is trying to create a new global order that is actually democratic, unlike the U.S. global dictatorship, which we saw under the unipolar era in the 1990s.
How about you talk about some of these initiatives that BRICS were discussed at the summit? Because yes, Donald Trump makes a huge emphasis on de-dollarization. But if anybody knows anything about China and Russia too would very much do something like they did, which is not go to a summit like this so that other emerging, developing countries, those in the global south, can be more of an emphasis. Then you don't know China then, because China would do such a thing in a heartbeat. It does not lose anything from not going to a summit like this. In fact, China always says, and I think this is what distinguishes the multipolar world now, from perhaps any other point in history is that you have such a deep emphasis on sovereignty that it actually influences how these countries are cooperating. And it's very much about elevating everybody, only so much so that these countries are working together on a very mutual basis, actually on as much of an equal basis as can be. And that's, I think that is really at the heart of why BRICS is so much of a threat to Donald Trump and, of course, the rest of the U.S. elite.
Yeah, BRICS is a so-called threat to the U.S. in scare quotes because the U.S. empire only seeks dominance and hegemony, and the U.S. refuses to join any organization it doesn't have veto power in. BRICS doesn't have veto. BRICS works on consensus, and it's about supporting peace and diplomacy, which is anathema to the U.S. empire, which is constantly at war. So in terms of de-dollarization, I'll mention a few different initiatives and institutions that BRICS is overseeing. Now, one of the biggest is the New Development Bank. This was created as an alternative to the World Bank, which the U.S. has veto power in. And the New Development Bank, the NDB, is currently led by Dilma Rousseff, who's the leftist former president of Brazil. She's from the same Workers' Party as the current president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And both Dilma and Lula have been victims of U.S.-sponsored lawfare, judicial warfare. The U.S.-backed judicial coups against both of them, against Dilma, who was impeached on completely bogus charges by U.S.-backed groups. And the U.S. Justice Department was deeply involved in all this nonsense, like Operation Car Wash. And then Lula was imprisoned, which is what led Bolsonaro to winning the election, because Bolsonaro was imprisoned, Lula was imprisoned on fake charges. And when Lula was the candidate running against Bolsonaro, he was going to win. He was leading in all the polls. He was imprisoned on fake charges of corruption. That then the U.S. backed this lawfare operation, which is what helped put Bolsonaro in power. And of course, Bolsonaro was an obedient U.S. puppet. And it's deeply anti-China, by the way, Bolsonaro, like Javier Milei in Argentina, another U.S. puppet. Lula was imprisoned on fake charges, and then he was later released, and the Brazilian Supreme Court expunged his record. All of the charges against him were erased because they were fake. And then the UN, a UN special committee of international legal experts investigated his case and concluded that it was fake charges. It was politically motivated. It was the textbook example of lawfare, judicial warfare. And now, in an insane example of irony, Trump is hypocritically claiming that Bolsonaro is supposedly a victim of lawfare. It's the opposite of the truth. Bolsonaro tried to carry out a military coup after Lula won the election. He refused to recognize the election results, and he tried to carry out a coup. And fortunately, not all of the military went along with it. Some of the military did go along with it, but not all of it. And that's why the coup failed. And that's why he's facing legal consequences. You cannot carry out a failed coup and not expect legal consequences. The last time I checked, in every single country on earth, if you attempt a coup and you fail, you are going to prison, if not worse. So Bolsonaro should be lucky that he's even facing the very fair trial that he is, because he would be executed in a lot of countries. So Trump is saying, I mean, this is why Trump is threatening 50% tariffs on Brazil in a blatant act of imperialism, of meddling in Brazil's internal sovereign affairs. And this is why Lula said to Trump, screw you. We are a sovereign country. You want to threaten tariffs on us? Fine. We will trade with other countries. We'll trade with China and BRICS countries. We don't need you. So this is another example of this multipolar world we're in. If we didn't have China as Brazil's largest trading partner, if you didn't have BRICS, I think Brazil would not be in a strong enough position to be able to say to the U.S., screw you. We're not going to do what you tell us. So in terms of getting back to de-dollarization and the initiatives, so Dilma is currently the president of the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, and one of her main initiatives has been de-dollarization. She's been promoting lending in local currencies of BRICS members, and the New Development Bank has been expanding and now has 11 members, including the 5 original members and the expanded members. And at this BRICS summit that was held in Brazil, they added 2 new members, which were Uzbekistan and Colombia. Now, Colombia's accession to the BRICS Bank is very historic because Colombia has historically been one of the most compliant U.S. client regimes in the world. And that's why the revolutionary former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America, that obediently did whatever the U.S. wanted. It was, an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the U.S. empire in South America, like Israel is for the U.S. empire in West Asia. Well, now Colombia has its first ever democratically elected left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, and he has pursued a non-aligned foreign policy, and he has supported BRICS, and he joined the New Development Bank. So the NDB has been de-dollarizing, giving out loans in local currencies instead of US dollars under Dilma. Okay. Another organization that BRICS is overseeing is the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, which was created by BRICS as an alternative to the IMF to provide short-term liquidity to countries that are having balance of payments issues. If they need to pay for their imports, they're running out of foreign currency. The CRA was created as an alternative to the IMF. The US has veto power in the IMF. The CRA is still very much in the early stages, but BRICS is talking about strengthening that. BRICS is creating what's called a new investment platform, the NIP, which will provide alternative investment opportunities for BRICS countries, especially countries with big current account surpluses, these big trade surpluses, like in China, for instance. They want to park that excess foreign currency they have that they get from their exports. So one of the ways they can do that is by buying foreign assets. And historically, they bought a lot of U.S. Treasury securities, so they want to find alternatives. So this is an alternative. The new investment platform in BRICS is finding ways for China and other countries to invest in non-US dollar assets. Another institution overseen by BRICS is the BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism, which is overseeing ways to create links between the central banks and the commercial banks in the BRICS countries, which works with another BRICS initiative, which is the BRICS Cross-Border Payments Initiative and the BRICS Payment Task Force, which is finding ways to link the banks in these different countries in BRICS so they don't need to go through the US-controlled SWIFT interbank messaging system. And so these banks in different countries don't have to use US correspondent banks, which is usually what happens. So there are so many different initiatives that BRICS is overseeing to pursue de-dollarization. Now, to be fair, Dilma herself said at the summit that de-dollarization is not going to happen in the short term immediately. It's a medium to a long-term process, but slow and steady wins the race. It's already happening. BRICS and China have signed an agreement to de-dollarize their trade, to trade with each other in their local currencies. Russia and China, Russia and Iran, China and Iran, Russia and India. They all have agreements. Also, the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia have agreements to trade in their local currencies. So there's a lot of progress. It's already happening. It's not just hypothetical. It's already in the works of de-dollarizing trade within BRICS. So even if they don't have a new global currency, which Lula is talking about, he wants to create a new global reserve currency to challenge the dollar. But that's going to be a more medium to a long-term process. In the short term, BRICS is de-dollarizing the trade and investment and capital flows among different BRICS countries and using their local currencies instead of the US dollar.